Typically, and perhaps not unsurprisingly, today's history buffs often overlook the 1930s and place it the 1940s, obviously due to all the incredible history that resulted from the Second World War. That said, had the war not happened, the 1930s may have indeed overshadowed the 40s in terms of world firsts and daredevilry in the realm of aviation. While many know of Howard Hughes today, many more, especially those from the younger generations, have forgotten his heroic feats. Today, we'll do a deep dive into Mr. Hughes' record-breaking flight around the world. But before we dive into the depths of Howard Hughes' extraordinary record-breaking flight, let's take a moment to set the stage. This wasn't just another adventure or a daring gamble. This was a mission meticulously planned, a feat that reflected both the height of 1930s aviation ingenuity and the restless ambition of one man. Hughes' journey came at a pivotal time when the world was captivated by transoceanic crossings and the race to define what was possible in the skies. You have to remember these feats were akin to Mars colonization today, and by understanding the backdrop, the era, the challenges, and the stakes, we can gain a clearer appreciation of why Hughes' accomplishment was not only groundbreaking, but would also prove to be a symbol of the times. So before we go any further, let's take a step back and see how all the pieces came together to make this moment in history possible. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh reshaped public perception of aviators with his groundbreaking solo flight across the Atlantic, carving out the archetype of the aviator hero. Following his triumph, other daring pilots would chase the same glory. In 1931, Wiley Post and Harold Gatty wrote their names in aviation history by completing a global circumnavigation in just over 8 days. 2 years later, Wiley Post returned to the skies and shaved a full day off the record, this time flying solo. Tragically, Post's adventurous streak ended in 1935 when he and celebrated comedian Will Rogers perished in Alaska during another ambitious flight, leaving a void on the global stage. Hughes revered Post's pioneering efforts, but sought not only to replicate Post's accomplishments, but exceed them. While Post's journeys and the basic, almost rudimentary Winnie May were feats of grit and determination, Hughes envisioned an entirely different approach. His plan was bold, a world-spanning flight that combined cutting-edge aircraft technology with a meticulously assembled team of aviation experts. In Hughes' vision, transoceanic flights would transcend the reputation of being risky stunts. They would become highly orchestrated, precision-driven missions that showcased what modern aviation could achieve. To that end, Hughes selected the Sikorsky S-43, a twin-engine amphibious plane delivered in the summer of 1937. However, when Hughes applied to the Bureau of Air Commerce for permission to fly around the world, his request was rejected. The reason? The flight was deemed lacking in scientific purpose. Undeterred, Hughes reapplied the following spring, emphasizing the meticulous preparations he had made. The Bureau initially seemed inclined to approve the request until an S-43 plane crash prompted them to reconsider. On May 23, 1938, they postponed approval pending an investigation, a frustrating delay that threatened to push the flight back another year. Time was running out. Hughes' meteorologists identified early July as having the most favorable weather conditions. Hughes knew that if he wanted to launch on schedule, he needed to act fast. Lockheed Aircraft had just rolled out the Lockheed 14, a sleek twin-engine passenger plane that could carry up to 12 people. For Hughes, it was the perfect blend of modern engineering and capability. After holding urgent discussions with Lockheed's team, he secured one of the new models in late May. With approval still pending from the government, Hughes and his trusted mechanics, led by the skilled Glenn Oatkirk, worked tirelessly at the Hughes aircraft hangar in Burbank. The plane underwent extensive modifications to prepare for the daunting 15,000-mile journey ahead. Hughes prioritized avoiding the radio failures that had plagued previous flights. To that end, they installed 3 separate radio transmitters, including a custom-built 100-watt unit engineered by Hughes' own technicians. The aircraft was also fitted with 2 specially supercharged Wright G102 Cyclone engines designed to boost both power and range. Inside the cockpit, the instrument panel stood as a testament to aviation progress, densely packed with cutting-edge instruments. In contrast, Charles Lindbergh's famed Spirit of St. Louis had been minimally equipped, featuring only the essentials: a compass, oil pressure and oil temperature gauges, a turn and bank indicator, and a handful of other basic instruments. Hughes' Lockheed, by comparison, was a marvel of precision. It boasted an advanced automatic pilot system capable of keeping the plane on a set course for hours. The panel included everything from dual manifold pressure gauges and fuel flow meters to flap controls, landing gear switches, and carburetor heat controls, each element meticulously chosen to give Hughes and his crew every possible advantage on their journey. Hughes, ever meticulous, continued refining his last will and testament even as he meticulously prepared for his world flight. In his will, he made provisions for those who had served him loyally. Lily Adams, a servant in Houston, was to receive $20 a week, while Beatrice Donner and a second servant known as Mr. Henry at his Muirfield Road home were set to receive $150 monthly. The majority of Hughes's estate was dedicated to something much bigger than himself: medical research. He left explicit instructions for his executors to establish the Howard R. Hughes Medical Research Laboratories in Houston, with a focus on combating significant diseases affecting Texas and beyond. Hughes was also profoundly affected by the disappearance of Amelia Earhart during her around-the-world flight. It was a stark reminder of the dangers he might face. As a precaution, he left detailed instructions in case he was presumed dead, but not definitively declared deceased. His will was to remain sealed at the First National Bank in Houston, with probate delayed for 3 years following his disappearance. On March 3, 1938, he mailed these instructions in 2 clearly labeled envelopes, one labeled number 1, containing his directives, and number 2, holding the will itself. Despite bureaucratic hurdles and pending government approval, Hughes pressed forward. His confidence never wavered. By July 4, 1938, Hughes and his seasoned 4-man crew made their way to Floyd Bennett Field in Brooklyn, a storied hub of transatlantic aviation. His team was the best of the best: Edward Lund, a flight engineer from Montana; Richard Stoddard, a New York-based radio operator with NBC; Lieutenant Thomas L. Thurlow, an Army Air Corps navigator; and Harry P.M. Connor, a Department of Commerce co-pilot who had already crossed the Atlantic. While Hughes publicly downplayed his goal, focusing on breaking Lindbergh's 33.5-hour New York to Paris record, speculation buzzed that this was just the first step in an ambitious journey around the world. Upon landing in New York, Hughes was greeted with overwhelming media attention that turned his stay into a stressful ordeal. Thousands of spectators packed Floyd Bennett Field to catch a glimpse of him and his crew. Hoping to dodge the constant cameras and questions, Hughes took refuge in a newly built pavilion for the upcoming New York World's Fair. There, he kept to himself, absorbed in reviewing weather reports, fine-tuning the flight plan, and supervising last-minute preparations. At the request of Grover Wayland, Hughes agreed to reframe the flight as a goodwill mission for the New York World's Fair and officially named the Lockheed the New York World's Fair in 1939. Yet even with the fanfare, his focus never wavered. It was always about the flight. Delays piled up. Government approval didn't come through until the July 8, 1938, and mechanical issues with the Lockheed kept pushing back their timeline. Finally, by the afternoon of July 10th, the repairs were finished, and the crew confirmed the plane was ready. That evening, Hughes arrived at Hangar Number 7 around 6 p.m. to review updated weather reports. Despite the sweltering heat and looming rain clouds in New York, the Atlantic skies looked promising. With no more barriers ahead, Hughes prepared for takeoff. Wayland personally drove him to the runway, where Hughes chose a southward takeoff to make use of the longer paved strip extending into smooth earth. The Lockheed was at full capacity, 1,500 gallons of aviation fuel, and enough equipment to rival a small laboratory. Altogether, the aircraft weighed nearly 13 tons, resting on special Goodrich tires built to handle the immense load. Still, Hughes couldn't shake the question in his mind: was the 3,500-foot runway enough? He inspected both ends before settling on the southbound direction. Just as Hughes was ready to depart, Wayland called for a brief ceremony. The plane was towed in front of the administration building, where 5,000 spectators had gathered. Wayland arranged Hughes and his crew in a half circle, their expressions cheerful and relaxed, as if preparing for a routine trip. Hughes, however, looked solemn, eager to get in the air. Dressed casually in wrinkled gray trousers, a white open-collar shirt, and a worn brown hat, Hughes seemed out of place among the formal speeches. Wayland praised the flight as a symbol of international cooperation and wished the crew luck, but Hughes appeared uncomfortable with the public praise. When asked to speak, Hughes pulled out a prepared note, a brief message to avoid being caught speechless. He spoke of fostering international friendship through aviation, his words simple but sincere. Afterward, he addressed the reporters, apologizing for avoiding them earlier, explaining he had been absorbed in pre-flight checks. The crowd applauded warmly as Hughes stepped away. In a final gesture of goodwill, Mrs. Harry Connor, the co-pilot's wife, broke through the police line and pressed a wad of chewing gum onto the tail of the plane for luck, whispering to a reporter, quote, "That's for good luck. I told Harry to be sure and bring it back," unquote. The moment Hughes slid into the pilot's seat, the tension lifted. He waved to the crowd, slid open the window, and brought the engines to life. The right first, then the left. The deafening roar of the engines was accompanied by a cloud of dust that glowed golden in the evening sun. With Ed Lund in the co-pilot's seat and Thurlow, Stoddard, and Connor in the cabin, Hughes taxied to the northwest end of the runway. At precisely 7:19 p.m. and 13 seconds, he opened the throttles wide. The crowd watched as the Lockheed surged forward, dust billowing in its wake. Initially sluggish under its immense weight, the Lockheed began its slow roll down the runway. The engines strained at first, but gained momentum with every second. By the halfway point near the administration building, the aircraft was roaring with full power, its sleek frame vibrating with intensity. Hughes kept his eyes locked on the path ahead as the runway's end approached rapidly. Just as the pavement disappeared beneath the wheels, he felt the plane's tail lift, a signal as subtle as it was significant. The wheels grazed the hard-packed earth before lifting into the air, signaling a successful takeoff. The gathered crowd erupted into gasps and cheers as the Lockheed rose, leaving behind a thick cloud of dust shimmering in the twilight. For a moment, the engine's roar changed, almost as if Hughes had briefly eased the throttles before surging back to full power. As the dust settled, the audience watched the plane barely clear the red clover fields at the south end of the airfield, climbing slowly but steadily. Hughes banked the plane gently over Jamaica Bay, tracing a path across Long Island before dipping the wings in a gesture as he passed over Katharine Hepburn's old Saybrook home. Then, the Lockheed turned toward Boston, officially beginning the world flight at precisely 7:20 p.m. on July 10, 1938. The flight wasn't just a bold attempt, it was the most meticulously planned private aviation mission of its time. Despite the advances in aviation, ocean crossings in 1938 were still fraught with danger. Months of preparation had gone into every detail. Hughes and his team had pored over weather data, reviewed technical plans, and rehearsed every leg of the journey to anticipate obstacles. To maintain constant communication, an elaborate radio system connected the plane to ships at sea and ground stations worldwide. Essential spare parts, including custom-made tires, were strategically placed along the route in case of emergency landings. Yet Hughes knew that Atlantic flights could be unpredictable. The Great Circle route from New York to Paris was 3,641 miles long, cutting across Boston, Nova Scotia, Cape Breton Island, and Newfoundland, before reaching 1,800 miles of open ocean to Ireland. The early part of the journey was smooth, with the Lockheed gliding over the east coast, but near Newfoundland, disaster struck. The automatic trailing antenna broke, cutting the crew off from radio contact for 90 tense minutes. By 1:30 a.m., they were flying over the Atlantic at 7,500 feet. Hughes kept meticulous notes in his logbook. Their speed hovered around 192 miles an hour, and he recorded wind velocity, altitude, and engine performance. Outside, thick clouds obscured the ocean below, a constant reminder of the isolation of transatlantic flight. As they pushed forward, strong headwinds battered the plane near Newfoundland. Hughes had to increase engine power just to maintain their pace, a move that led to excessive fuel consumption. Worry then crept in. Would they even reach Paris? At 2:30 a.m., Hughes radioed the ground crew in New York, his concerned plane. "I hope we get to Paris before we run out of gas, but I am not so sure," he said. He began to throttle back the engines as much as possible to conserve fuel. Luckily, they soon escaped the stormy weather and caught a favorable tailwind. Dawn brought a brief sighting of land, Valencia on Ireland's southwestern tip, before the clouds closed in once more as they neared France. Approaching the French coast, radio operator Stoddard made contact with the French liner Île-de-France. The ship relayed their position to Le Bourget airfield, but at the Lockheed's high descent speed of 220 miles an hour, Hughes reached Paris before the update even arrived. The Lockheed touched down smoothly at Le Bourget to the astonishment of the waiting crowd. Hughes had crossed the Atlantic in just 16 hours and 38 minutes, shattering expectations and cutting Lindbergh's record nearly in half. Hughes touched down around 4 p.m. under a light drizzle greeted by thousands of Parisians who had gathered to witness history. The crowd watched as he stepped out of the plane, visibly tired and drawn from the long journey. Among those waiting was American Ambassador William C. Bullitt, who stepped forward to congratulate Hughes. When asked how the flight had been, Hughes gave a characteristically understated reply, quote, "We had a good flight." Bullitt invited Hughes and his crew to rest at his Paris home, but Hughes politely declined. This stop in Paris was never meant to be more than a brief pause before continuing the ambitious journey to Moscow, 1,675 miles away. Yet plans shifted when a rear landing strut, weakened during the New York takeoff, was found damaged. The French mechanics deemed it irreparable, but Ed Lund, the flight engineer, proved them wrong, successfully fixing the issue after hours of work. By midnight, the Lockheed was ready, towed to the same spot where Charles Lindbergh had famously landed in 1927. The rain had stopped, but now strong crosswinds swept across the field. After a heartfelt send-off and with congratulatory telegrams stuffed into his pockets, Hughes climbed back into the cockpit. The takeoff was tense. The plane struggled to lift, reaching only 50 feet before dipping in the turbulent air. In the cockpit, Hughes fought the controls, working against the forceful crosswinds. Slowly, steadily, the Lockheed climbed higher until it disappeared into the night sky. The next morning at 11:15 a.m., Hughes and his crew landed safely in Moscow, marking another triumphant leg of their journey. The Russians went out of their way to make Hughes feel welcome, even presenting him with a box of cornflakes for breakfast. However, Hughes, always driven and focused, brushed aside the gesture, uninterested in food and eager to refuel and continue the journey. As the Lockheed sat on the runway, well-meaning Russians surrounded the plane, offering praise and asking questions. Recognizing his impatience, Soviet pilot Mikhail Gromov, famous for his own record-setting flight from Moscow to San Jacinto, California, stepped in, sensing Hughes's mounting anxiety. Gromov reassured him with a promise. No one would disturb him any longer. With the crew's food and water supplies replenished, the Russians also offered caviar, a gift Hughes graciously declined, stating, quote, "Every pound counts," unquote. After running the engines and taxiing up and down the runway to ensure everything was in top form, the crew finally took off for their long journey across Russia. Back in the United States, however, Hughes's world flight captured the nation's imagination. Headlines tracked his progress daily, and his story led every radio broadcast. His fame reached such heights that some Americans were even naming their newborns after him. Hughes's appeal wasn't limited to his bravery, it was his mystique. He was a figure of contradictions, a movie producer, a daring pilot, an aircraft designer, a playboy, a shrewd capitalist, and an heir to fortune. Hughes defied easy categorization, forging a life that was uniquely his own. Despite all the accolades, Hughes maintained a humble, self-effacing demeanor. He was admired for actively using his inherited wealth to pursue meaningful achievements. Publications like the New Republic even praised him for not being spoiled by inherited wealth. Meanwhile, back in Russia, the Lockheed pushed deeper into Russian night, flying over the vast expanse of Siberia. The next major stop was Omsk, an industrial hub in western Siberia, where the airport's uneven runway earned the nickname Cabbage Patch from Ed Lund. Preparing for the desolate stretch ahead, Hughes ordered the fuel tanks filled to their 1,750-gallon capacity for the first time. The plane, fully loaded, struggled to take off from the muddy, treacherous runway, but managed to lift off. After a 10.5-hour flight, they reached Yakutsk, a remote outpost in northern Siberia. An interpreter was supposed to greet them, but never arrived. Instead, they found an English-speaking schoolteacher who helped them refuel and inspect the plane. Once cleared for departure, they took off again, heading for Fairbanks, Alaska. Ed Lund later described every takeoff as a thrill, but he admitted that Yakutsk was especially nerve-wracking. During the flight, the crew witnessed a stunning sight, the sun and moon visible simultaneously above the horizon. Their awe was interrupted when an unexpected Siberian mountain range appeared ahead. According to their U.S. Hydrographic Survey maps, the mountains shouldn't have exceeded 6,500 feet, yet Hughes's altimeter showed they were flying at 7,000 feet, and they were still on a collision course with a cliffside. Reacting quickly, Hughes pulled the Lockheed into an ascent. As the plane climbed, ice began to form on its wings, weighing it down. At 10,000 feet, the engine strained under the load, but Hughes expertly guided the plane over a 9,700-foot peak. Reflecting on the close call, Hughes later remarked, "It's a damn good thing I didn't try to fly out of Yakutsk at night." On Wednesday, July 13th, at 3:01 p.m., Hughes and his crew touched down safely in Fairbanks, Alaska, marking another triumphant step in their journey. There, Wiley Post's widow was present and bid them farewell with tears, a poignant reminder of the risks and sacrifices of aviation heroes. The following morning, the crew made a quick pit stop in Minneapolis, refueling in just 34 minutes, the shortest of their entire flight. With their sights set on the finish line, the team was eager for a smooth final stretch to New York. Despite his extreme fatigue, Hughes insisted on remaining at the controls for the entire 3-day journey. The leg from Minneapolis to New York, however, was anything but smooth. Turbulence buffeted the plane as it flew through rough weather over the Great Lakes. Exhausted yet resolute, Hughes skillfully guided the Lockheed through swirling cloud banks, maintaining focus despite the chaos outside. At 2 p.m., the Lockheed passed over Scranton, Pennsylvania, marking the beginning of its descent towards New York. A message from Floyd Bennett Field came through, assuring the crew that their arrival would be orderly. Quote, "You are in no danger of being mobbed," unquote. At 2:33 p.m., the Lockheed broke through the low-hanging clouds just west of the airport. Hughes, ever meticulous, decided on a flyover of the field just before circling Jamaica Bay for a northern approach. As he passed over the administration building, Hughes glanced down and felt a shiver. Below him was a massive crowd of 25,000 people packed onto the airfield. Spectators lined every possible vantage point, rooftops, sidewalks, cars, and fences, all cheering and waving as the gleaming silver Lockheed made its pass. Police struggled to maintain order as thousands surged onto the tarmac, hoping to get closer to the plane. At precisely 2:37 p.m. on July 14th, 1938, Hughes brought the Lockheed down for a smooth landing, completing his historic journey. The New York World's Fair in 1939 had set a new world flight record, 3 days, 19 hours, and 17 minutes. Hughes was now one of the most famous men in America. As the Lockheed landed, the plan was for Hughes to taxi to a designated spot on the apron where police would secure the area. Hughes would place a commemorative wreath on the very spot where Wiley Post had completed his historic 1933 world flight. Grover Whalen and Mayor LaGuardia were to deliver short speeches, followed by a few words from Hughes himself. The event was meant to be respectful, orderly tribute to aviation history. However, those carefully laid plans quickly unraveled. Hughes, perhaps too exhausted or distracted, taxied the Lockheed to the wrong location. The official welcoming committee, along with the press and the police assigned to manage the crowd, found themselves hundreds of yards away. The moment the Lockheed came to a halt and its engines were cut, the crowd surged towards the plane in an uncontrollable wave. Hundreds of spectators poured past the barriers and onto the field, creating complete pandemonium. Whalen and Mayor LaGuardia, caught off guard by the chaos, rushed to the scene. As they arrived, Whalen was visibly flustered and LaGuardia, uncharacteristically out of breath, struggled to restore order. Meanwhile, Hughes's crew members, Connor, Thurlow, and Stoddard, emerged first, greeted by the enthusiastic, unruly throng. Hughes followed, stepping down from the plane looking disheveled. His clothes were smeared with grease, and his face bore the wear of the arduous journey. As Hughes descended, the crowd closed in. People jostled for a closer look, some snapping photographs, others attempting to grab pieces of his clothing. Before Hughes could move away from the plane, the crowd had swept him toward a makeshift reviewing stand at the wingtip. Mayor LaGuardia managed to calm the spectators momentarily by stepping to the microphone. Quote, 7 million New Yorkers offer congratulations for the greatest record established in the history of aviation, unquote, he declared. Welcome home. Hughes, still overwhelmed, approached the microphone. His voice was weak and barely audible. Quote, I am ever so much honored. Thank you very much, he managed to say. Someone in the crowd shouted, louder, Howard, prompting a faint smile, but little more. Police eventually formed a wedge to guide Hughes and his crew through the mass of people to a press tent for interviews. The press conference, though, was no less chaotic. Spectators crowded in, planes roared overhead, and reporters struggled to hear Hughes's brief, exhausted responses. Whalen finally ended the session and escorted Hughes to a waiting limousine. As the car made its way through Brooklyn and Manhattan, Hughes caught glimpses of cheering crowds lining the streets. Whalen brought him to his home at 48 Washington Mews in Greenwich Village, a quiet refuge from the public frenzy. There, Hughes finally relaxed. He sipped a light scotch and soda while calmly answering a few more questions about the flight. Later that evening, Whalen led Hughes upstairs, where he enjoyed his first bath in over a week. Emerging refreshed, Hughes asked for a clean shirt. Whalen's valet Juan fetched a new white shirt in Hughes's size, but after he dressed, Hughes didn't return to the group downstairs as expected. After some time had passed, LaGuardia grew anxious and asked Whalen to check on Hughes. Whalen went upstairs only to find the room empty. A brief search revealed an unlocked back door leading to the courtyard in 8th Street. Realizing Hughes had left without a word, Whalen informed LaGuardia, who grew visibly agitated. In truth, Hughes had simply slipped away, quietly exited through the courtyard. He hailed a cab and made his way to Katharine Hepburn's Turtle Bay townhouse, seeking solace away from the overwhelming spotlight. There, however, Hughes spotted a crowd of reporters and photographers outside Hepburn's home and decided not to stop. Instead, he directed the driver to continue on. The cab eventually dropped him at the Drake Hotel on Park Avenue. There, Hughes checked into his suite by himself and finally got some rest, his first uninterrupted sleep in 4 days. The following day, the city of New York turned out en masse to celebrate his record-breaking journey. Over 1 million people lined the streets, turning the event into one of the most extravagant ticker-tape parades the city had ever seen, eclipsing even Lindbergh's legendary celebration 11 years earlier. Around 750,000 people crowded Lower Broadway alone, transforming the thoroughfare into a sea of confetti and streamers that blanketed the buildings from the Battery to City Hall. At the starting point in Lower Manhattan, Hughes seemed visibly nervous. He lingered awkwardly, adjusting his worn hat, licking his lips, and avoiding eye contact. When the motorcade began, led by mounted police, he appeared relieved. As the open cars rolled along Battery Place and turned onto Broadway, Hughes cautiously stood on the back seat, gazing up at the rows of spectators who packed windows, balconies, and rooftops. By the time the procession reached Wall Street, Hughes had dropped his hat to the floor of the car, seemingly forgotten in the excitement. Paper snowstorm intensified with ticker tape and streamers wrapping around the city's iconic landmarks. In quieter moments, the fluttering of the streamers against the buildings was the only sound. Initially shy, Hughes gradually relaxed and started waving, responding warmly to the overwhelming show of support. When the motorcade arrived at City Hall, the mood shifted to a more formal, measured celebration. Hundreds of fans crammed into the council chamber, enduring stifling heat to see Hughes honored. There was only one minor stumble when Grover Whalen mistakenly referred to him as Edward Hughes, but the moment passed quickly. Jesse Jones, chairman of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and a long-time acquaintance of the Hughes family, delivered a heartfelt introduction, recounting memories of Hughes's father and acknowledging Howard's accomplishments. Taking the podium, Hughes began tentatively fumbling with his handwritten notes. He joked that reporters had already taken half of them, drawing a few chuckles. As he spoke, Hughes emphasized that the world flight was no mere stunt, but the result of meticulous planning and preparation. Downplaying his own role, he insisted that he and his crew were not supermen, and credited the designers and engineers who had crafted the modern American airplane. Hughes also took the opportunity to praise airline pilots as the finest aviators in the world, highlighting their bravery and dedication under extreme conditions. Beyond the speed record, Hughes pointed out that the flight demonstrated the reliability and efficiency of American aircraft. He expressed pride in helping to restore the U.S.'s leadership in aviation, reminding the audience that the airplane had been invented in the United States even though Europe had since claimed most major records. Hughes hoped the flight would spur international demand for American aircraft, noting that even a small increase in exports would make the entire effort worthwhile. The celebrations didn't end in New York. Hughes traveled to Washington, D.C. and Chicago for additional parades and events. Though eager to return to California, he agreed to one final appearance at Jesse Jones' request, a hero's welcome in Houston, his hometown. On July 30th, 1938, Hughes flew the Lockheed to Houston for the most overwhelming reception yet. 10,000 people crowded the airfield, which had just been renamed Howard Hughes Airport in his honor. An astonishing 250,000 people, 3/4 of Houston's population, lined the streets, cheering and showering Hughes and his crew with confetti. It was a citywide celebration that marked the pinnacle of his homecoming. That evening, Hughes attended a banquet at the Rice Hotel, seated with his aunt Annette Loomis and Martha Houston. Governor James Allred of Texas praised him, declaring, "All of Texas is proud of your achievement." Hughes stood and humbly attributed his success to the genius of his father and the dedication of the employees at the company his father had built. In his characteristic humor, he remarked that growing up in Texas was all the preparation anyone needed for flying around the world, as Texas itself seemed to contain everything. Though visibly exhausted, Hughes delivered a heartfelt speech, emphasizing that everyday service by airline pilots mattered more than any spectacular feat. He joked about how even he wouldn't qualify as a first pilot on an airline without completing an apprenticeship as a second pilot. The audience laughed, but Hughes insisted, "That's really true." Later that night, after midnight, Hughes arrived at his family home on Yocum Boulevard, where he hoped to rest. To his surprise, a group of old Houston friends he hadn't seen in years awaited him on the back porch. They reminisced about the past, and when they left, Hughes confessed to his Aunt Annette that he was shocked to see them, confessing, "I didn't think any of my friends would speak to me after Ella and I got a divorce." The following morning, he briefly greeted more Houstonians and relatives at the Rice Hotel before making his way to the Hughes Tool Company. Despite it being a Sunday, all 3,500 employees had gathered to see him. Hughes reconnected with longtime employees, including Lewis Enns, the superintendent who had taught him to operate a lathe as a boy. Hughes fondly remembered Enns and even sent him Christmas gifts over the years, including a cherished tailor-made camel's hair coat. When Hughes returned to the airport, hundreds of fans broke through police lines to surround his car. People handed him scraps of paper, dollar bills, and anything they could find for an autograph. Hughes cheerfully obliged, patiently signing everything except $2 bills. Quote, "I'm afraid I'm too superstitious to sign my name to a $2 bill," he explained. By noon on the 31st of July, 1938, the New York World's Fair 1939 was refueled and ready for departure. Hughes bid farewell to his aunts and a few cousins, climbed into Lockheed, and took off at 1:35 p.m. As the plane roared down the runway, it ascended into a dense cloud bank, quickly obscuring the view of his hometown. Houston had embraced Hughes as one of its own, honoring him more than it had ever honored any other citizen, including his father. The Houston Post captured the city's pride, noting that Hughes had won his own wings, conquered the elements, and returned home in unparalleled glory. Hughes's aunts, Annette and Martha, watched the silver Lockheed vanish into the clouds, unaware that this would be the last time they would see him. Hughes lived another 38 years but never returned to Houston after that historic visit. After completing his groundbreaking aviation endeavors in the late 1940s, Howard Hughes shifted his focus towards the business world. During the 1950s and beyond, he became heavily involved in expanding his hotel and casino operations in Las Vegas, reshaping the city's entertainment landscape. Hughes also delved deeper into corporate acquisitions, including the airline industry. He gained control of Trans World Airlines and later initiated complex business dealings that further increased his influence in aerospace and other sectors. Rather than returning to his early filmmaking pursuits, Hughes concentrating on becoming a powerful business magnate and a significant player in the Las Vegas real estate and entertainment market. That said, before his tragic struggles with mental health, Howard Hughes embodied what it meant to be a pioneer in aviation. His celebrity and wealth before his accomplishments were enough to satisfy anyone, yet he took on tremendous risks to redefine what was possible. Each leg of his journey carried hazards that could have ended in disaster. The grueling transoceanic crossings placed extraordinary strain on both man and machine. Weather conditions often turned unpredictable, with violent storms threatening to tear apart the aircraft mid-flight. The aircraft itself, though, cutting edge for its time, was unproven under such extreme and continuous use, leaving Hughes and his crew vulnerable to mechanical failures far from any safe landing strip. Despite these dangers, Hughes pressed on, relying on meticulous planning, superior technical skill, and an unwavering belief in the potential of American aviation. He risked not just his fortune, but also his life, pushing the boundaries of what could be achieved. In doing so, he proved that the era of barnstorming daredevils was giving way to a new age of precision, endurance, and calculated ambition. Hughes's willingness to face such formidable risks ultimately paved the way for advancements that reshaped the entire aviation industry. and for that, both he and this flight deserve to be remembered.